An array of new weapons, new weapon bonuses, and weapon nerfs that have dropped the damage of weapons to the point where they're comparable to the Great British Pound right now have all come with patch 1.3. So in this video I'm going to break down what those changes mean, which weapons are now best and worst from each weapon category, and generally provide a monstrous amount of info that will likely be informative to the most experienced players. But if you want to learn just about the conclusion, click here, or if you want to learn only about a certain weapon category, click one of the following options on screen. The assault rifles in a division consist of 7 sub-weapon categories: the ACRs, the AKs, the FAUs, the new G36s, the M4s, the P416s, and the SCAR-Ls. This graph shows us damage on the left in millions and time on the bottom in seconds. As an example, if I add the ACR sub-weapon category, this diagonal line represents the ACR while it's firing, and this horizontal line represents the ACR while it's reloading. So from this point to this point is the cycle time of a weapon. We then simply duplicate that cycle time across the chart to see how it performs over the course of 60 seconds. Adding the AK sub-weapon category, we can see that the ACRs have slightly better burst damage than the AKs, but the AKs have more sustained damage, giving them the edge over the ACRs overall. The FAUs, although they look good on this chart, are 3-shot burst-fire weapons that have a bloated amount of RPM. As a result, this is a more realistic plot of how the FAUs perform in-game. The G36s are a new addition to patch 1.3, boasting good accuracy and the best reload speed and optimal range of any assault rifle. Adding the G36 to this graph, we can see quite clearly why it became an immediate favourite. This weapon is going to be nerfed in the future, however. The M4s have more burst damage than the AKs and ACRs, but simply cannot compete with the burst damage of the G36. M4s look to be on par with the sustained damage of the AKs, but you'll consume a lot more rounds with the M4. P416s, like I said in my assault rifle video, are the worst of the assault rifles, coming in just under the ACR at every turn. Finally, of the assault rifle category, we have the SCAR-Ls. This sub-weapon category is best for sustained damage, after the G36 of course, so when the G36 does get a nerf, the SCAR-Ls might be the best choice when it comes to assault rifles. For now though, the G36 is a clear winner, and not just for its damage. The light machine guns of the division consist of 4 sub-weapon categories: L86s, M249s, M60s, and the RPKs. The L86s have good burst damage for LMGs, but are more comparable to assault rifles due to their low magazine size. For example, here is where the AK variants would sit, and this is not including weapon bonuses yet, meaning that in this patch, L86s are now better than AKs. The M249s have a 100 round mag as standard. Coupling that with an extended magazine mod allows them to fire for 17 seconds straight before they have to reload, but of the large mag weapons, this is the hardest to control. The M60s, in my opinion, are the best large mag LMGs simply because they're much easier to control compared to the M249s. They do less damage, yes, but you'll likely make up for that with how many headshots you'll miss with the M249s. The RPKs have the fastest rate of fire of LMGs and a larger mag size than the L86s, but their base damage is lower, resulting in them being inferior to the L86s at burst and sustained damage, which makes the L86s the king of LMGs in PvE and PvP. The Marksmen Rifles consist of 5 sub-weapon categories: M1As, M44s, of which the custom M44 is best because it allows a mag mod, SCAR-Hs, SRSs, and the newly added SVDs. The M1As, as you can see, pump out insane amounts of damage, but in this patch the M1A received an accuracy nerf and does have some competition in this patch, which we'll get into later. For now, even though the M1A can fire at 300 RPM, I've knocked it down to 200 RPM to make it more realistic based on tests, and that's including the capable weapon talent, but even with that change, the M1As are literally off the chart. Adding the custom M44 to this chart, we can see just how big the gap is between DMRs and bolt-action rifles, and this is the best bolt-action rifle in the game, because if we add the SRSs, its lower base damage becomes immediately apparent. As for the SCAR-H variants, their large magazine size gives them a good lead over bolt-action rifles. Just be aware that you will use a lot of ammo with the SCAR-H variants, and its reticle bloom is very high. Finally, of the Marksmen Rifles, we have the newly added SVD sub-weapon category, which has the least amount of bloom of any Marksmen Rifle, but has an optimal range of only 34 meters. Its base damage is pretty low too compared to the M1As, making it only slightly better than the SCAR H's when it comes to burst and sustained damage, but because the SVDs have such a low amount of bloom, they're much better than the SCAR H's realistically. The shotguns consist of 5 sub-weapon categories: the AA-12, called the showstopper in-game, double barrel shotguns, which comes as a primary version or a secondary version, M870s, SASG-12s, and the Super Duper 90. I recently made a review video about the showstopper shotgun, but if you want the gist of it, it fires fast and has a large magazine size but doesn't allow a mag mod, has bad accuracy, and doesn't hit very hard at all. The double barrel shotguns, as you might imagine, fall short in sustained damage due to their low magazine size, but because there's no difference between the primary and secondary version of this weapon, your sawed-off shotgun will do just as much damage as the primary version, even though it sits in your secondary slot. The M870s are better than the showstopper initially, but then the showstopper's mag size and RPM makes it win in sustained damage. The SASGs have great burst damage and sustained damage, surpassing all the other shotguns here. Not to mention it has great accuracy as standard, but like the showstopper, you will be eating up a lot of shells with this weapon. Finally, we have the Super 90, initially beating the SASG in sustained damage, but then the Super 90 has to reload, which is the major disadvantage of this weapon as seen here. Now, all of these shotguns have their merits, and I believe that this is one of the best balanced weapon categories that has good variation still, but if you're looking for a favourite here, the SASG is a great place to start. I won't be covering the sawed-off version of the shotgun with the 6 different sidearm subcategories because it's technically a shotgun. These sidearms include 5.86 Magnums, M1911s, M9s, of which the officer's M9A1 is best for its larger mag size, PF45s, of which the custom PF45 is best for its larger mag size, PX4 Storms, and the newly added X45s, of which the first wave X45 is best for its increased mag size. The 5.86 Magnums have a large amount of recoil and low magazine size, but this weapon's major disadvantage is how it doesn't allow a magazine mod, much like the M9s and the worst pistol subcategory, the PX4 Storms. When you put the M1911s and PF45 on this graph, you can see just how much a mag mod makes a difference. The X45s are a new pistol sub-weapon category in patch 1.3, and boy are they powerful. I was expecting this to be on par with the M1911s, but they are in a league of their own. To give you an example of the magnitude I'm talking about here, this white line represents the SASG shotgun, and they say the G36 is OP. The SMGs consist of 7 sub-weapon categories: AUGs, MP5s, of which the full auto versions are the best, MP7s, the newly added PP19s, T821s, SMG9s, and the Vector, of which the tactical Vector is best for its slightly faster reload speed. The AUGs in this patch received a 10% damage nerf, which, if I add the full auto MP5s, shows that the MP5s are now better than the AUG for sustained damage and only slightly worse for burst damage. MP7s are still king of burst damage, but they are incredibly ammo hungry and cannot compete with the sustained damage of the AUGs or MP5s. Looking at the newly added PP19s, they have a monstrously large magazine size of 53 rounds, good optimal range, a fast reload speed, and the same base damage as the MP7s. Adding the PP19s to this graph, you can see just how far that large magazine goes, dominating the other SMGs for sustained damage and not too far behind the MP5s or AUGs for burst damage either. In my best weapons for PvP in the Division video, I stated that the T821s are the worst SMG. Well, that is only the case for burst damage, as the T821s have roughly the same amount of sustained damage as the MP7s, but you will lose a lot more rounds when you use the MP7. The SMG9s have come a long way with the nerf to AUGs, as they are now better for sustained damage over the AUGs, but still not as good as the MP5s for burst damage or sustained damage. Be aware that these SMGs have the worst accuracy of any SMG. Finally, of the SMGs we have the popular Vectors, which now have burst damage that is only slightly better than the MP5s, and the worst sustained damage of any SMG, showing that the 10% damage nerf these received in this patch really did hit home. Taking the best weapon from each weapon category, we get a good look at the best weapons in patch 1.3. However, I haven't included the new weapon bonuses yet, of which SMGs have crit, so I'm going to add 20% crit chance and 100% crit damage to this graph to make it more realistic. Assault rifles can now have between 17.5 and 24% enemy armor damage as a bonus, so if we update our graph with that information, the G36 actually competes with the M1A, not so much for sustained damage, but certainly when it comes to burst damage, making it the best burst damage weapon in the division. Light machine guns can now have between 21.5 and 29% extra damage to targets out of cover, bumping up the LMG to be on par with the SMG and the X45 pistol. Be aware, however, that if your target is in cover, the LMGs, at least out of these weapons, are the worst. Shotguns can now have between 223 and 274 stagger. Stagger acts as a crowd control to stun enemies briefly, a lot like explosive rounds, but stagger doesn't increase damage or work on other players. Be aware that shotguns benefit more from the one is none talent, so they do slightly more sustained damage than what is shown here. Submachine guns had their bonuses changed. It was crit chance in the previous patch, now it's crit damage between 36 and 48%. Adjusting the graph to suit the SMG changes, we see that SMGs are now only slightly better than LMGs, so this change from crit chance to crit damage has impacted SMGs, but the major difference is how the LMGs do extra damage to targets out of cover now. My recommendation if you want to use an SMG in this patch is to use the pulse skill as much as possible. This will make SMGs very viable over other weapons, and they will probably remain the best automatic weapons when the G36 nerf hits. So in conclusion, the G36s are now the best assault rifles, the L86s are still the best LMGs, the M1As, surprise surprise, are still the best Marksmen Rifles, first wave version of the X45 is now the best sidearm by a country mile, the SMGs are still the best shotguns for PvE, where the M870s, SMGs and Super 90s are all good for PvP, and finally the PP19s are now the best SMGs for PvE, where the MP7 is still the king in PvP. I want to thank Spider for putting this spreadsheet together as it helps me a lot with the numbers, and Doc for updating his website so fast in this patch, links in the description. If you learned something in this video, please give it a like as I want to gauge the continuation of this series for each patch. Thank you for watching, and while the weapon balance changes didn't solve every problem with weapons in the division, they're at least doing something about it.